8? No, I don't know. Must be cooler right now.
So it's quite pleasant outside. I was out an hour ago to get my daily Slurpee.
I see.
My cold caffeinated drink.
Yeah, right now it's less than 20 degrees outside, but it's supposed to get up to about 37 today.
Mm-hmm. Well, stay in the shadows. So guys, it's 10 past 4. I think maybe not everybody has joined. So maybe at the same time we have plenty of material. So I would actually like to start on time just in case, right, Marco? You're going to be presenting some of it. So
yeah.
So let's start. So welcome again to the second session of the core working group. I'm Jaime Jimenez, and there is Marco Tiloca, and we are your chairs for the day. Welcome, and last day of the IETF. I guess it has been pretty busy for everybody. And now I cannot change the. Just a second.
Thanks for being here at the last session, by the way.
Yes, thank you very much, everybody. So please know that the note well applies. I see some comments in the chat already. Yes, thank you, Francesca. The minutes will be there. I think we already have minute takers for the day, right?
Francesca and Michael, thank you both.
Thank you very much. Note that the IPR guidelines apply to this session and other sessions. Blue sheets, we don't have to worry because Meet Ecosystem will take care of that. And as Jabber scribe, I guess I can be the Jabber scribe while Marco is presenting. Right, Marco?
Yeah.
And then
otherwise we alternate.
We switch.
Yeah.
So, note well applies, etc., etc. Please behave well. We had the Tuesday session with already several of the items and clusters. For today, we have basically two big clusters, which is the CoreConf cluster and the group communication cluster. So CoreConf, you already know that we had issued the working group last call, second one, that ended last 29th of July. We haven't had many comments. I hope that means that people have read it and are happy with it. But to have closure on this set of documents, we will have Ivalo presenting them now. So please, Ivalo, if you're around, and you are, yes, you can go ahead anytime. Sorry, I need to, sorry. Yep.
Okay, so, okay, you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so hello everyone. I will be presenting the changes that were made to CoreConf as a result of the comments from the first working group last call and the discussion that followed. Next slide, please. Yeah, you can go to the next one. Okay, thanks. So I will start with the changes that were made in the Yankee board draft. It had one new revision. Maybe the most important change to that document was a slight change in the representation of bits encoding. It's fully backward compatible with the previous version, but now it is possible to encode more efficiently some cases that we don't know anyone using, but it is safer this way. And the other change that might be interesting for implementers is that in the CBOR tag registration table, there were some inconsistencies with the text that was before it, and the values from the text were the correct ones. So if you have been using only the table, please review those changes. The rest of the changes, I believe, are mostly for clarifications and should not affect implementations. They include some improvements of examples. Also, the difference, the usage of YANK template is replaced with YANK data extensions, as it was noted that YANK templates is not a very clear term to be used. And the other change to this document was that some people wanted to be able to use it on its own without using Komi or seed drafts. And for that reason, we moved some of the media type and content type definitions to this document. That will also affect, of course, the Komi and seed drafts. So that's it for this document. Next slide, please. So the next document is the seed draft. After some discussions, we decided to rename seeds to young seeds, as on the internet there are a number of things that are named seeds, and it could lead to some confusion. Other changes to the document include clarifying the early allocation. I believe now it is much better described. And as I said, adding content type registration. We also clarified that when there is a change of semantics of a young node, a new seed needs to be used. Another change that was requested was not to depend on RFC 7951 for definitions, but instead just use definitions from RFC 7950, which defines the YANC 1.1, and define on our own any such definitions that are needed. We also made it explicit that we use YANC 1.1 in the YANC module that is defined in the seed draft, and improved slightly the descriptions of the YANC modules in the YANC module. And another omission that was brought to our attention was that we needed to register the YANC module namespace in an IANA register, which is now done. And the last change that was requested was not to mandate usage of predefined sets of seed range sizes, as that was deemed unuseful and rather confusing. So I believe that was all for this document. Next slide, please. For the Komi document, we received feedback that the usage of CoreConf and Komi is not very clear. When do we speak about CoreConf and when do we speak about Komi? In the end, we decided that what we actually meant by Komi maybe doesn't need to have its own name, and we reworded the text so that we only use CoreConf when we wanted to speak about the protocol. Other changes, as I mentioned earlier, we moved media types and content types registration from this document to YANC CBOR. We improved the security consideration section, adding more recommendations, and fixed some things in the examples. So next slide, please. And the final draft from this suite is YANC library. There we also did not register previously the Yank module namespace, and now we fix this. And also improve the security consideration sections. So that is all the important changes to those documents. There were, of course, a number of small editorial changes as well. Next slide, please. So we believe we have processed all the comments that we have received. So now we would like to ask the chairs and the working group, yes, what do they think?
Yeah, right. So I'm the shepherd for these documents, and I must admit this IETF has been a little bit taxing for me with 2 BOFs, 1 dispatch item, several new working group drafts, and a couple of other things. So I'm a little bit behind in doing my shepherd work. The working group last call ran out the day before yesterday. So the next thing I'm going to do is do my shepherd review that I'm supposed to do, and maybe nag a few people to actually say they have read the update, because getting no response on a working group last call is not a good thing. So that should actually never happen. It's a little bit harder to avoid that if it's a second working group last call for something that has had only little nits being fixed. So I try to do that. I don't know how successful that can be when it's already August, but then I'd send a shepherd report with the list.
Okay, thank you, Karsten.
Thank you, Carsten. Jaime here. Just on the needs list, I'm noticing that in the Yan library, there is some Yang validation warning. So you guys might want to check that out as well. I think it's for the normative language that you guys use. I don't know exactly what the error is.
Okay, I will check it.
Yep. Michael, you want to say something in the call? Not in the chat?
I don't want to say anything. I've read the document, so I'm.
A bit louder. We cannot hear you well.
I have read the documents. Not maybe all of them, but I have read the ones I cared about. So I guess I haven't read the last iteration of the last 2 weeks or 3 weeks or something, but I've read them before.
All right.
Thank you.
Okay, so we have done both working group last calls, and I think the authors agree that they are satisfied with the current state of the document, and basically we are missing maybe Carsten's write-ups and few other needs, but after that I think we can just conclude the working group last call and ship it. Marco, any thoughts as well?
Totally agree. Totally agree.
Okay.
Great.
Yep. Great.
Okay,
So then,
thank you.
and thank you for all the presentations multiple times through several IETFs. Thank you so much for spending all that time, Ivalo.
Thank you very much.
Same, thank you.
And then, Carsten, do you have because you mentioned that during August can be a bit tricky. Do you have a timeline in mind?
Well, for myself, I could do it next week because it's vacation time, so that's when you review a draft. But
Okay.
I'm not sure whether that's true for everybody else. I want to have a final statement from. So let's see how that goes.
Okay, let's say we catch up back on this after August. Is that around September?
So
Beginning of September?
I think by mid-August we should be able to say something.
Fair enough.
If some of the crucial reviewers say I can only get to it in September, then I think we should heed that.
Okay, so we will keep an eye on the mailing list and follow there.
Right.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So we move to the next topic, which is the GroupCon cluster, in which we have few working group items and few new additions. And we start with the GroupCon Bs. So there you go, Marco.
Yes, thank you. So an update to this working group document, core group on BIS, now version 1. Next slide, please. And to recap, this document is intended to obsolete the experimental RFC 7390, and this is intended to be instead a standard struct document. The idea is also to update the co-op RFC, especially as to the handling of the tokens on the client side, and observation that now can happen also targeting a group of servers. So what's in scope is essentially how co-op can work over UDP and IP multicast, considering also the latest developed functionalities, and considering both a secure setting with group score and an insecure setting. Next slide, please. Updates in this latest version were mostly about addressing a review we got from Jim. Thanks a lot for that. We especially clarified several details about group memberships of nodes in the group, because different types of groups are involved here. And we clarified that application groups and co-op groups are a server matter, while a node that is client only, for instance, doesn't need to be inside an application group as a server sharing a resource, or in a co-op group as a server listening to a multicast address, while instead it's important for client-only nodes to be also in security groups. Related to an old issue in GitHub that we closed about response suppression, we don't talk anymore about legitimate requests. It didn't make that much sense. And also clarify that within the suppression policy of the server can just be not responding because there's nothing to say, unless it's really required by the application to produce a response anyway as part of the signaling. Clarified also about the token reuse on the client side, when that can happen with more fine-grained timers, and simplify the test comparing this as a difference with the base unicast case. Next slide, please. Also, we have a section discussing at the high level the case where we have proxies involved in the picture. And we clarified also the feedback we got in reviews that the client is possibly in a better position than a proxy, definitely, to judge about when stopping receiving and processing responses associated to a single group request and forwarded back by the proxy. Also, it's not really up to the client to just stand up and decide what multicast scope to use exactly. That's something to be pre-configured. Bit more detail clarified also on the cancellation of the group observation, just to be better aligned with the ideas of 7641. And on the security part, we have now introduced also the pairwise mode of group score, so both modes are covered. We clarify that it's essentially in scope of this document the membership and participation in a security group, not really the creation and the management that actually happens in other document. And we are now using also and referring the COSI-BIS documents and the relevant registers here. Next slide, please. Okay, open points and issues now. We have a few more still on GitHub, and the issue number 1 was discussed essentially for a long while also on the mailing list. And it's about the possibility that following a multicast request, one of the unicast responses coming back from the server can have a source port number different than the destination port number of the request. And I went through the thread on the mailing list again. It seemed to me we were converging to, well, just like the source address of the response, the source port number as well doesn't really play a role on the client on correctly and successfully processing the response. So there's no real reason to overall forbid this from happening. So in accordance to this, we were thinking to include some explicit text in the draft and say that indeed that source port number can be different than the destination port number of the request, and hence the client must be able to handle this situation. Any more comments on issues about this issue? Then I think we can adopt this change. Okay, next, please. Right, there was also some discussion about having a little better policy and set of criteria for response suppression on the server. Right now, it's based on the response code to be consistent across different responses. But we were thinking actually to follow what it has been doing for the no response case, and instead consider policies for consistent suppression based on the response code class instead. So we were planning also to make this change in the document. Any issues with this change? Okay, we'll do this too. And we were still tracking an old proposal, I think, came from Thomas in a review about considering using URI host as a piece of information to indicate application groups. This is probably a niche case where these comments are from ESCO on the GitHub, trying to highlight possible delicate things to take care of. And this seems possibly useful in case of virtual servers involved that can be distinguished through the URI host value. We wanted actually to ask for more opinions on this, if this is something we really have to explicitly admit, cover, and possibly solve a bit better in the draft. Any opinions on this?
Christian answers sounds like something that we should have at least allowed. I don't know how often it will come up in practice, but architecturally, I think it's good.
Thank you. Any more opinion on this? Okay. Karsten also on Jabber, I can see. Okay, we'll add some initial text. Next slide, please. Right, there are a few more open points other than the issues on GitHub. Right now, the client is listed to support possibly also the admin local scope, and Jim noted in his review that that's not the case in the text of the co-op RFC covering multicast traffic. So we need to justify why we are having this here. And I was looking back at 7390, and there it was covered in support for possible discovery use cases. So we may actually want to do the same kind of to propose the same kind of argument here. Would that work for you, Jim, and for others?
I don't remember the point I was trying to make.
You were surprised to see this here while it's not in the co-op RFC.
I think that could have been it. It also could have been something about you may have to support multiple multicast addresses at the same time under v6. I'd have to actually go back and look at the original message to see what I was trying to say. So I don't know.
Okay, you made us discover again anyway. The 7390 was covering that too. So we have more text to add anyway. Thank you. This is the last point also, if I'm not wrong. This was a more recent discussion that was started by Christian, if I'm not wrong, on the mailing list about mapping between application and security groups. So right now this is bidirectional with many-to-many in principle. And in one direction, the mapping is fine. So many different application groups can use the same security group. That's just fine. On the other direction, it can be delicate, meaning if one single application group is associated to multiple security groups. And Christian provided two examples to think through, actually. And case A is pretty good to consider, also the supported case. One may want to have multiple security groups that differ in their configuration, for instance, the algorithms and the parameters they use. So in such a case, to give more flexibility to clients with different capabilities, well, the server would have to join all of those groups, while the client, any of those, that is fine to it. So this looks good. The case B instead can look a bit more problematic, especially for application, and there would be an attempt to have one security group for each possible access control property. And some voices raised on the list were saying, well, for something like that, it's totally separate. It should go on resource properties. Instead, we shouldn't mix access control to the medium and the key material with access control to the resources. So out of this, a possible proposal can be, we can include case A as a relevant example for the mapping also in that direction, and mention also case B as something not recommended to do. So of course, we'd like feedback about this. Any early feedback on this? Well, we can sketch some initial text along these lines then, and possibly more will come on future reviews. Okay. Yeah, that was it. We plan to address the issues on OpenPoint. In the next version, we have planned for some interop tests. Most of the things were covered already in the test of Grupos core itself. We've had some local tests with and without security about observation in the group. We want to do some more tests interoping this part, and also considering the little small share that Blockwise can also have in a multicast context. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Marco. I would like to get an estimate of the group of who has read a version of the draft already. Other than, I mean, just please. Okay, Christian, Jim. Yeah, I forgot to mention. Just click on the microphone to request audio, and we will see your name there. So we have Christian, Jim, Francesca. Okay.
We can count Thomas also. He gave a review some time ago. Yeah.
Okay. And who would be willing to read and provide a review, or who is interested in this draft in particular? In some. Okay, Carsten. Yeah, go ahead. Okay, the same as the usual suspects. Yes. Okay. Very good. So there you have just for the record, for the note takers, that in a way, Carsten, Jim, Christian. Volunteer to do a review later on. I would like to see of the participants, like there is some that have been attending for quite a while. I mean, don't be shy. I mean, any feedback, any review is welcome, even if it is editorial. So please just go ahead and engage. Okay, so then we move to the next ones. You had other slides on this one? Yeah, the backup slide?
There may be some backup slide, but
okay.
Yeah,
but you don't need it, right? Okay, yeah.
No. Okay, thanks. And this is an update on the Grupos core document. Next slide, please. Right, so this was a pretty big update compared to the latest version that was presented at the April virtual meeting, after which we submitted this version in June, addressing all the open points that were raised in April, plus remaining open points from James and Christian's review. And this version went in working group plus call that was concluded 10 days ago or so, out of which we got more comments from Jim and Peter. Thank you very much. And last week during the hackathon, we had a second round of interop. I have more points about that later. We plan some more tests anyway in the near future. And during the hackathon, there was also a new proposal from Jim that I can raise also today, about the possible restructuring for partial IVs to consider. Next slide, please. Right, the main update was restructuring the body of the document to present clearly what are now two possible modes of operation of Grupos core. The group mode has always been around as the main one to use, especially for requests sent over multicast. It must be supported. This is about encrypting the message with group share key material, adding also a counter signature for the sake of source authentication. But now we also have the pairwise mode that may be supported, and if so, it has to be used for unicast request to avoid possible attacks that we document. And it's especially useful in this respect where one goes for unicast request in the context of blockwise transfer or echo request challenge. And in this case, the message is encrypted with pairwise material, the two endpoints derived using partially the group key material and their own asymmetric key material. And the advantage is that there's no signature, still ensuring source authentication. So we reduce overhead on the wired. And we signal if a message is protected in one mode or another using a new flag bit in the OSCORE option. Next slide, please. So other than that, that was, again, the major thing. It was greatly about an editorial revision of section 2, when the common sender and recipient context are presented and described. The procedure to derive the pairwise keys for the pairwise mode is also described. You can just see a summary on top of the slide. We have also added some more text collecting contributions spread a bit over there in the previous version about how to handle an update or a loss of the security context or the mutable part of it. For instance, in case a group breaking has happened or the device rebooted. And we have also aligned a number of parameters to the new COSI-BIS documents and registries. Next slide, please. Yeah, as I mentioned before, we had some more tests last week, testing our own RISE implementation and GIMS. We had successful interrupts again of message exchange in group mode and derivation of the pairwise keys. And we had local successful tests of message exchange in pairwise mode that we aim to also interrupt very soon. Next slide, please. Right, and now open points mostly as comments received from the working group last call. Both Jim and Peter raised this point that right now in the common security context, we have redundant information about the key parameters that are included in two different entries of the security context. So essentially the counter signature key parameters is not needed as purely redundant, and we plan to remove it from here. It has essential implications then on the storage of every group member. Any objection to this removal? Okay. Then about the pairwise mode, which involves the derivation of a Diffie-Hellman secret, right now, in case EDDSA is used, that means converting the curve to the Montgomery format and using the x25519 function to compute the Diffie-Hellman secret. And if that happens, well, that curve and that function are also mandatory to implement. So Jim was considering instead, was suggesting to consider a remapping to the short Weierstrass curve instead that is discussed in the LWIG group. And we wanted to clarify, Jim, what you are more precisely suggesting. Do you want us to add this as a possible alternative, like, by the way, we are already doing in the security consideration, or do you actually prefer that the curve and the right method become mandatory to implement?
I don't know that I have a preference. The LWIG people may have a preference because they're doing this, so they may think that this is a better answer for them. But they're also doing it. They're also using the Weierstrass curves for the signature algorithm as well. I don't believe that there is any way at present to indicate if there's a choice of curves which one you would map to.
Just saying, what we have now is, in a sense, safe and stable and was implemented and tested. So if we shift to something else, that may require more time to have something runnable.
And the math is a little bit harder too.
Yeah.
But the document at a minimum needs to be clear that that's what it's doing, because since it didn't say, I assumed it was mapping to the Weierstrass curves.
So it is fine in principle to keep the map to Montgomery and suggest as a possible alternative, for instance, for optimization, the Weierstrass curve.
But only if you can communicate that information.
Okay, possibly as part of the security context.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. We'll add some text along these lines to start. Yeah, the next point was another request clarification from Jim in his working group last call review. Yeah, we discussed the possible wraparound of the server sequence number, and he was asking if it's about the sender sequence number or the partial IV instead. And yeah, we believe it's the sender sequence number that then, of course, is used as partial IV. Are we missing any detail here to clarify better?
Christian Amsus, why are we talking about the wraparound at all? We are incrementing a sequence number, and that's not an operation that is on modular arithmetic, but that's on an integer that can be exhausted.
We use the word exhaustion, actually, in the draft.
Okay, thanks.
I'm going to have to look at this again. Sender sequence number is not what I was thinking I was using, so I may have just had a bad point.
Okay, no problem. Thank you. Next slide, please. Yeah, another question for Jim. Right now, to support observation, also in case the key material is changed in the group, we are already saying that the client and the server store the sender ID of the client when the observation was started. So the sender ID included in the original observation request, that's fine. And that's in fact going to be the value included in the external ID used to protect the notifications. So all of them, even after a group rekeying, will match the original observation request. So far, so good. Jim was wondering if we ever really consider storing also the KID context of that original observation request. Well, we don't store it right now. We think we don't really need to, because at least for that same reason, it's never part of the external EAD. So there shouldn't be any need to store it.
The implication of storing it is it would become part of the external AAD.
Okay. Well, I don't think we were planning for that, so. Do you suggest to store it anyway, just for extensibility?
Storing it because if I'm trying to tie it back to the KID of the original request, a particular KID may only have meaning within the context of a particular KID context. So if I look at the KID of the current message that's coming back, it's not going to be what I would have expected to be the K. It's not going to match my sending KID in any way.
Okay, so it's more of a second layer of internal checking, so to say. Okay. Okay, we can store it. Thank you. I see some activity on Jabber. Anything you should address from there?
I think Michael may have a question. Oh, there you go.
So I believe that, so we discussed in COSI this RFC 8152 counter signature question, and I believe it was claimed that it's being used in group comm, but it's being used in a way that has no preference, has no impact. Changes in how we do it has no impact on how it's used here. I don't know if you were part of the conversation in COSI as well, or some other people.
I was in COSI, and to my understanding, it doesn't impact operations happening here because we are countersigning an encrypt 0 object. So it should be okay. But from an editorial point of view, I understood if we have to point at a document describe a correct way to countersign, we need to point to some different document than the one we point at now.
Right. So, so the point is, does this part of this working group have a preference for how COSI goes forward? But do you really think? I think you can just point at 8152. I don't think you need to point to a new document, and I think that would be just good to get in the record that why we're doing that.
Now we are already pointing to the base struct document,
Yeah,
just to avoid referring the obsoleted one. But so I understood that when this document was raised up was mostly for the sake of editorial consistency to point to the right thing. Otherwise, the implementation shouldn't be affected.
nodding vigorously. Okay.
Thank you, Michael. Okay. Then Jim also raised the proposal to change your mind about the resetting to 0 of the sender sequence number in case the key material is changed in the group. So right now it's not reset. We just let it grow unless the application decides to do differently. But Jim claimed that, well, having it reset in case a group wrecking happens make life easier for group members to detect the wrecking happening in case, for instance, they lost some wrecking messages. Christian?
Wouldn't that mean that there could be 2 requests that have the same KID and the same external AAD that would match to that a response could be matched to? I think this would endanger request-response binding.
The key would have changed, I think. If there is a wrecking, there was a change in the master secret.
But we already, just in the point above, we said that an observation can span several, can survive a rekeying. So then when you get the response to the observation, this response could be the could be a response to a request made with any sequence number n out of all those that were generated with that key.
This would be possibly addressed by resetting the observed numbers of ongoing observations on the client, together with replay windows on servers, of course. Jim?
I'm trying to figure out what if I understand what Christian just said. Part of the reason to look at this is it makes a detection of exactly what do you mean by rolling over the sequence number, because it's like at this point, do you say that the sender sequence number rolls over when it gets to a maximum value or when it gets back to the starting value?
When that happens, sorry, Christian, go ahead.
I don't think that this is about wrapping the sequence numbers. It's just about the sequence number going back to 0. And if the client sends an observe request with what happens to be the same sequence number in both before and after the rekeying, and has a response going on, then a response from the one observation could be just by switching over the token mapped to that other observation, and they share the same data that is authenticated in the external AAD.
That's, yeah. I mean, that's one of the reasons Sakam was asking if we needed to put the key context into the external AAD information. But if you go back one slide, if you look at the last point, you're saying you do you're detecting a wraparound of the sender sequence number. But is that when it gets to a maximum value or when it gets back to where you started?
When it gets to the maximum value, if it is something supported at all. Otherwise, we talk more generically of exhaustion.
But that means every time I rekey, I keep moving towards that maximum value, and I never get back reset to 0.
Right, not because of the rekeying itself. That would happen only in case of exhaustion later on.
But how do I tell the difference between those two cases?
You don't. After an exhaustion, the idea was for the node to go to the group manager and get a new sender ID.
Or a rekey.
Or rekey if the group manager decides to take the opportunity to do that. Yeah.
Okay. How do I tell the difference between those two rekeys?
In the first case, it's just a message back to the requester node with the sender ID only. In the second case, it's to the whole group.
But if I'm a server receiving messages from you, that makes it a little bit harder for me to tell, because either I may not think you are quite at the same point, and all of a sudden the number is going to drop big time.
Okay, that's why you prefer to have the number reset in case of rekeying, to have detection easier.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I could get that. Then I understood Christian has some concerns for observations that could have been messed up.
Right, and Christian's concerns for observations are going to be messed up either way, I think. And I think that we need to sit down and think them through, because I think they're probably valid.
So roughly, it seems that either we store the context ID and then it has also to be part of the external ID, or we have to kill observations in case of rekeying.
I think we might have a third option by including the key basically the n of the key generations in the external AAD, but this is definitely something that we would need to talk over through with a piece of paper and more than 5 minutes to spare.
Okay, we'll think through it. And thanks for the input. Okay, we can move on. Perhaps we were already at the next. Yeah, here now. This was the last point about the proposal we got from Jim to consider during the hackathon. Right now, on every node, we have a single sender sequence number space. So a fresh value is used both in group mode and in pairwise mode with no distinction. So the proposal from Jim was to consider 2 spaces instead. And if we do that, this would be the new situation. On every node, we would have a sender sequence number to use for the group mode. And then for each associated recipient, a pairwise sender sequence number for that recipient. And then on each associated client of a server, we would have the group replay window and the pairwise replay window. So what are the pros and cons on this? Next slide, please. Well, the pros are that the sender sequence number will be exhausted much less frequently, and I understood also from Jim they will have some advantage in terms of code reusing from a basal score footprint. And as cons, early to imagine, well, more storage to keep these extra sender sequence numbers and replay windows. And after some analysis, we believe this can turn out into more overhead on the wire for more times when it is required for the server to consume a fresh partial ID of its own and include it in a response. So we made some analysis on 2 points. The first one is this, having fresh partial IDs consumed by the server in responses. And I think this is the case where the response is protected in a different mode than the request. And then issue number 2, now we have 2 spaces to synchronize. And this would mean some adaptation to the echo way to do that we describe in Appendix E3. Next slide, please. This is an example of the first issue. No need to go into extreme details here, but at least building this example, if the first request is sent in group mode and the response is protected in a different mode, so the pairwise mode, in case we don't do like I imagine that the server consume a fresh partial ID, but just goes for the same one of the client, then we are opening up for a problem in the right following exchange. If in that request, message number 3, now in pairwise mode, accidentally and by bad luck, the partial AV used by the client has exactly the same value of the red group partial AV above, that will end up for the server later on to use the same cipher nonce with the same key. And we don't want that, of course. So to avoid this by construction, in message 2 already, the server should consume a partial AV, and that would mean more overhead on the wire than it would be possible otherwise in pairwise mode. Next slide, please. Yeah, on the other issue, as I mentioned, this would require some adaptation for the echo challenge way to synchronize the now 2 spaces between server and client. And if the first request is in group mode, and then the response with the echo option is in pairwise mode, well, the third message with the echo option has to be in pairwise mode. It includes a pairwise partial AV, and that will synchronize the pairwise space. But the group space is not synchronized yet. So that requires for the client's group PIV to also go into this request. And the question becomes where? And well, if you explore the possible option and things they require in turn, it can get even more complicated. So we wanted to raise this up, of course, and we think we can even have a separate discussion to get more opinion from implementers, especially, to understand if this overall pays off. Are there early opinions already about this proposal?
Yeah, that may be a totally stupid question. When I'm sitting in a group and I'm asking, has anybody had a drinking problem here? And I want to get confidential responses to that. The fact that some sequence numbers move may be disclosing something. And I'm just wondering whether that's actually a problem here or can be ignored.
Good point. It can reveal, I think, some more information on the communication pattern with an exact other group member.
Okay, maybe that's worth considering.
Thank you.
It might say that you responded. It doesn't necessarily say how you responded.
I think Joran had a question. I revoked the audio because it was some echo. Joran, if you could just switch on the mic.
Yeah, sorry about that. Is this better?
Yeah.
Okay, so just going back to Jaime's question here about the issues. I think, yeah, we talked a little bit about issue 2 previously, and I'm still, that's something that we probably can solve, although it's not very beautiful with the transport of the group PIV. But the issue 1, I hadn't thought so much about previously. So the issue with that's something, I mean, if there is this leading to more problems related to nonce reuse, I think we should be careful. And also remember that the purpose of the pairwise is to reduce overhead. So if we now add more overhead because of in the pairwise mode, that's somehow taking a step back. So yeah, so that's my concern about separate SSN spaces.
Christian answers. I think that the trouble that came up with those 2 issues show that at least for the purpose of code reuse and saving some, basically 1 bit of space per message, the separate SSNs are nothing that we should follow any further on. we might want to look into Carsten's point, but I think that this is too the effect is too minor to warrant all those trouble that we would get into as well.
Well, at least documented.
Sorry, Carsten, we couldn't catch up, or at least I couldn't catch up that.
So if we consider the effect too minor, it should be mentioned in the security considerations as we considered this too minor.
Okay, well, the discussion on this can, of course, continue online, and more feedback are welcome. Because in case it would be a big change, so before doing that, we need to be sure. Okay, I think the next one is the last slide. Yeah, addressing as much of these points as possible for next version, more discussion of this last point, more tests with focus on the pairwise mode. That's it.
Very good. That was a very productive discussion. I'm thinking, so we have about 50 minutes, then 4 drafts, 10, 10, 10. So we can, no, we have 40 minutes actually. Okay, but then I would like
we
to
saved a lot of next time from Tuesday.
Yeah, that's a good point too. Yeah. So, but I would just like to know from the group the same question as before. So, who has read a version of this draft? I see Christian, Jim. I'm assuming Carsten, you have as well, right? And Michael? Nope. Okay. Okay, and who will be reading a version of this draft in the coming, let's say, coming month, few weeks? Let's say a couple of months because there is vacation. All right. Okay, very good. So great. Okay, well, I think we are making progress. There is a lot of new things, lots of discussion. That's a good sign. So then we can move on because, yeah, we are again a bit tight on time. There were some interesting. Oh no, not on this one. There were no other slides. Sorry, never mind. I thought you had some implementation demo.
I'm done.
Yeah. So then we move to Christian and to OSCORE discovery. Christian, you're requesting to share screen. I guess you just mean the microphone, right? Oh, all right.
No, I was requesting. I wasn't meaning to share video.
All right, there you go.
Okay. So this is basically continuing on the topic of group communication. Next slide, please. And in the interest of time, I will not start with when Marco and I were having lunch back in London, but just summarize the what this is about. So a device joins joins a network, is configured to join a particular group, but doesn't know a lot about that group. Maybe the group manager hasn't even arrived yet, and this whole document is about how web links, typically stored in a resource directory, can be used for the device to find the join resource and possibly even the name of the security group when it only has the name of the application group. It might also use this to find the multicast address this is joining on. Next slide, please. So what happened since this was last presented? We've received a lot of comments from Jim. Thanks for that. We've aligned terminology with what is now in GroupCombis. We've already talked here about the topic of what is an application group and what is a security group and how they can interact. So this is part of this discussion is coming from here. We've run into slight trouble with the difference between the serializations we're using. So the COSI registry is strongly typed, meaning that in theory, someone could register an algorithm with a name string out of 3 characters minus digit 1, digit 0. Link format doesn't really like this. Now we're clarifying it. Next slide, please. And by the way, the clarification is you just can't use such algorithms here. We have a quite extensive example of how this could be used in an application that is oriented, or that's modeled by a backnet application brought in through Peter from the Fairhair organization. This used to have some things in there that are common in those kinds of setups, but not really documented here and not relevant here either. So those were removed from here. Yeah, the next point is basically all the things that we've talked about. So next slide, please. Next slide, please. Thanks. We now have all our examples in Coral, as well as the examples from the fair here part in a separate appendix, because otherwise the text would just be too hard to read if there's one example in this way and one example in that way. So this should now be aligned with future use of a Coral-based resource directory, even though it's not fully clear how this will look in all detail on the lookup side. This is making a few assumptions, but at least there is syntax there that explains how this maps to Coral. Next slide, please. On the open issue side, and much of them is also coming from Jim's review, there's the question of where does the information about the authorization server relevant for a joining resource come from? Right now, we say that the group manager is putting it in there. And I still think that's the way it should, the place it should come from, because the group manager in the end needs to know which AS it's talking to. But if there's any more feedback on that, I'd appreciate it. One way for this to come into play is, by the way, next slide, please, the same as for here. So another piece of information whose origin is a bit unclear is the application groups. Now the group manager doesn't deal in application groups itself, but somehow we need to get that information into the resource directory. And the way it looks like right now is that the group manager will be provisioned with that information at the time the group is created by the actual administrator for the group. So that's the way this information is moving into the group manager, and from there can be propagated into the resource directory. Next slide, please. Another thing that, another point where we could use some input is the actual way we are advertising those resources. Right now, we say that this is advertised as a membership resource in form of a resource type. Now there's this long-lasting and always resurfacing discussion of what is a resource type, what is an interface. But I think that we can we can put this on the shelf for the moment, because the BCP 190 discussion around the group joining the ACE group communication, about the ACE profile for groups will result in something that we can put in there anyway, because the hard-coded paths are making way for resource discovery, as in a similar way that we are doing it in resource directory. Next slide, please. Now, so we have those open points. I think the things that were in the reviews we got so far that are not in the list of open points are addressed, and we'd like to have a bit more feedback on those above things, and otherwise wait for other documents and align with other documents, that is group administration as well as the upcoming updates to ACE key group come. And getting another pair of eyes would be on this document would be quite nice, especially in light of possible further interest of the working group. Next slide, please. So that's it from me about this. Is questions, comments?
I haven't read this draft yet. I'm thinking the new link attributes that are defined, is this something that we should, that's right. So we have been working on this document that should gather all of the new parameters that are being registered. And this one has also, what, like another dozen of parameters, right?
Yeah.
Maybe we should, at least on that side note, we should sync in order to have them together in the same doc.
Yeah, so if such a document is coming up, then I'm happy to copy over those parameters. Personally, I'm a bit focusing more on the Coral side, where we don't need to define all of those individually and register them somewhere. But of course, in the end, if they are used both in link format and in Coral, then there will need to be some authoritative place where it's described how they are transformed, and that could just as well be that registering document that is coming up. So,
which I mean, actually, I'm not sure if it is coming up. I don't remember anymore who was working on that at the moment, if anyone. We could, of course, just use Coral only, but I don't know if that's something.
Jim on Jabber seems to support this.
All right. Yeah.
So
yeah, but that's the thing. I don't know if everybody's up to that. Sorry.
Yeah. Maybe let's bring this up briefly when later on when we know where how Coral is advancing, because I think this is later on this later today. Later today.
No. Coral was last Tuesday, unless it's in unless I'm very mistaken.
Oh, yeah. Sorry then.
I mean, Coral was slotted last Tuesday, but there was no new updates.
Okay,
Klaus, you can chip in if you are in the call and mention, plans, ideas on this topic, if you are there. Otherwise, yeah, I agree with you that we can see later on. Yes. And another question I have, sorry for monopolizing the questions. You mentioned Fairhair and Backnet and for the examples, right? All right. Yeah. So it could be great to, I don't know if this is something the core should do, core working group, but if there is any special, I don't know, where was the slide?
Yeah, one for
yeah, there, for instance. So if there is some interest and there is some interest for interop or for collaboration, maybe this is something for Think to Think RG or other groups to do, and maybe invite core when it happens and this kind of stuff. That'll be really useful, I guess.
Yeah, I think there's been a few changes in how things are going over there, so I don't know whether there's anything that can actually be interoperated on anymore. Okay. Peter could probably say a bit more, but I don't see him in the call, so.
All right. Well, that'll be something for the future as the draft progresses. Anyway, this was still a non-working group item, right?
Yes, but feel free to ask to change that.
Yeah, well, I think maybe it needs a bit more work, right?
Happily.
Yeah. So then we are. You have some backup. You want to use them? I mean,
yeah, no, just skip over that. It's just
all right.
Just in case a particular question came up. Where
these are very useful. These kind of diagrams that show the use cases.
Yes, but we'll need to refine them a bit for the icky cases. Oh, me again. Okay, so multicast responses is a topic that came up over lunch with Marco about a year ago in Prague. And just to recap and to kind of give the context, next slide, please. The motivating case for this was where Francesca's original thoughts about how PubSub could be done in a more could be done with in a more, say, in better alignment with the resources, with URIs as identifiers, in that we wouldn't rely so much on putting data, but could actually observe them. And of course, observing data to a multicast address is something that original co-op does not allow, because multicast is only used for requests, not for responses. And this document explores the way how to change this. Next slide, please. So we defined in the first place that a response can be sent to a multicast address, and because the token assignment there is a bit trickier, we say that the token space between a particular server and the multicast group as a client belongs to the group, but as the group cannot do anything on its own, it entrusts the server with the token management, and thus the server gets to pick a particular token for a particular observation. Of course, it has to inform the clients, and in a very analogous way, the server also needs to come up with a request sequence number that goes into the external AET of a protected request. Next slide, please. So what happens is that we introduce a phantom request, which is created by the server at the time the observation is started. Now, whether that happens at dawn of time, which is around 1970, or whether that happens when the server decides that there are too many individual observations that it would prefer to switch to multicast, is up to the server. But at some point in time, the server says, this is a request that I imagine was made. So that's why it's named phantom request. It never actually hits the wire, but the server creates the request, kind of internally loops it back to itself, and there it has all the freedom to send it from the multicast address. And it will also pick a sender sequence number and a sender ID for this request. When now the unicast requests come in from a client that wants to join this group, or doesn't even know that it wants to join the group, but wants to observe that resource, the server sends back an error response because it does not want to handle all those individual observations. But it says, no, you can't observe this. But instead, there is an observation, and this is the very data item that the server created in the first place. It hands it in an encapsulated form to the client. This data item includes all the information about the group, so the client can join this group, and then the server can later on send all the notifications back to the group, and the clients in the group know what to expect. Next slide, please. Now, in the process of refining that whole thing, we've recently redefined the parameters. So we used to have the co-op message completely dissected into all its components, payload and sequence and observation number and content format and so on. And now we've chosen an expression that's more along the lines of the server creates this request and tells the client that this request as a byte string currently in co-op over UDP encoding was sent. And then all that is in that error response, which we call the informative response, is the actual request, the response that would have been sent to this request, and the various addresses involved, server address, client address, port. Some of the server address part can be optional because that's already where it was requested. The last notification is a co-op message just protected the same way, and this allows the client to have an immediate representation of what it is observing now without waiting for the next multicast to be sent out. And we do consider making this optional. So feedback on the topic of whether you think that it makes sense for the server to always have a last representation versus the client having to wait for the next multicast notification would be much appreciated. Next slide, please. Another thing we recently introduced is the counting of clients. So the responses to multicast are all unconfirmable because otherwise we would quickly overload the network and run into all other kinds of trouble. So the document now includes a way for the server to express how much feedback it would like to get. And then the document says that the clients, if they receive, when they receive this option and a random event indicates that they are one of those selected clients, then they can inform the server that they are still interested. And thus the server can maintain an estimate of the number of observers. There is now pseudocode that describes how this is handled on the server side, and it's rather trivial on the client side. We do consider changing the precise expression of this from giving a divider back to the client to giving basically the binary logarithm of a divider to make calculation easier, at the cost of losing some granularity for the server to configure the amount of responses that it expects. But I think either will work, and this should be kind of good enough for the current document state. Next slide, please. What we've also elaborated on now is how the client could obtain this phantom request in alternative ways. So this is now all expressed in Coral, and could be, for example, used in a pub/sub context, where the pub/sub broker keeps a copy of the phantom request and all the addresses, and thus helps the client to basically join the group without ever bothering the original server. Two more things that we changed is that we now have updated considerations for congestion control, and that the modes in which this communication happens in the context of OSCORE, that is no pairwise, always group mode, because everyone needs to be able to decrypt it, were made explicit. Next slide, please. So summarizing, we've changed a bit here, but we have a lot of things to do for the next iteration as well. One is to cover the use of proxies. So what happens if the client that is interacting with the server is actually proxying for someone else? How would this even work? Which is relevant, especially when there is cross-protocol proxies involved, because the original client might not even be able to talk co-op over UDP, but some proxy in between would be able to leverage the optimizations that can come from this. And also the cacheable OSCORE document that I will talk about later provides some generalization of this. So I think that we can align the terminology between those to the point where this is not introducing everything that it needs on its own, but can build on the concept of a consensus request rather than introducing phantom request right out of the blue. And as before, if someone could look at this with another pair of eyes, that would be great. Thank you. Yeah, that was the perfect call on the next slide thing. So, any questions, comments?
So, Göran Selander. I just like to say that I think this is a fantastic piece of work. I hope it's not too complicated. I haven't really looked at it yet. I just really like how you managed to solve the problems that we didn't manage to do when people asked us, how do you do caching and how do you do proxying with OSCORE? So yeah, I'm a big fan. I haven't read it yet, so I'll get back to you when I have.
Thank you.
Hello, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Wow, there were some strange audio issues on my side. Sorry for that. I was talking and then I realized nobody was listening. Sorry, Francesca, for jumping over. I just wanted to very briefly mention the pub/sub because it's related to this draft. So the authors of the pub/sub draft, and Klaus also, who is also an author now because he did the pub/sub version that uses Coral. So we are trying to merge the two drafts. We have a work in progress document, but I haven't gotten around to finalizing it, and probably we'll have it in some next version. But I was thinking maybe I can run with you the HackMD, and maybe you can give some ideas on this. And yeah, thank you. That's all I have.
I think the pub/sub could especially profit from this when kind of competing with the other pub/sub protocol, in the sense that this could be used to completely spare the actual broker any interaction at all with the clients.
Yeah, exactly. Yes. So I will run through you after this the HackMD. I'm sorry for jumping over. There was Göran and Francesca as well. So please just go ahead.
I think Francesca was just trying to express Carsten's written expression of support.
Okay, so does it mean that we have volunteers to read the draft and provide feedback formally? Okay, we have one. Carsten has volunteered. Jim, Göran, great. I can also volunteer, as it is very related to the pub/sub one. Thank you.
Thank you.
So we move to the next one. We have time, I think. So feel free to spend some time discussing.
You can skip many of this. It's all backup from what Christian presented.
Christian, your backup slides often are actually, or they look more interesting to me than the actual presentation, I have to say. Don't get it wrong.
I can take credit here. The slides for those two presentations were prepared by Marco, and I just tuned them to my text.
Okay. Okay, Marco, please go ahead. You have about 30 minutes, I think. No,
10 will be enough. Hi, Marco here. This is recent new work we started with ESCO to support proxies in group communication. Next slide, please. So we have the group combis document that we presented earlier today. That focuses on group communication with co-op over IP multicast, and it has a big part already describing at a high level the case where proxies are used and highlighting at a high level some big things to be aware of and possible issues, even open areas to be addressed in detail. And among them, well, the client is going to receive multiple responses forwarded back by the proxy to what is technically a unicast request sent to the proxy. So this is kind of a weird thing already. The client will be in a position not to distinguish the different origin servers producing those responses, and the proxy may have no idea when to stop getting these responses to be forwarded back to the client. And in group combis already, well, two high-level strategies are drawn. By the way, the proxy either forwards back individual responses to the client or aggregates. Next slide, please. And yeah, here we take the first approach and describe a complete solution in a sense that describes how things can work with that first approach. We believe addressing all the related issues that are documented in group combis. So practically we define a signaling protocol between the client and the proxy based on two new co-op options that would fulfill those requirements. And again, we take the approach of individual responses forwarded back to the client. The proxy has to be aware of this and properly configured, of course. And this version 1 is the result of processing comments we got from Christian's review. Thanks a lot about that, and especially about the properties and the processing of the two options, and a very nice suggestion that we call nested OSCORE, now in an appendix, that can be very useful in case we have OSCORE between client and proxy. More on that later. Next slide, please. So the overall rationale is that when the client sends a request to the proxy to be forwarded to a group of servers, essentially with a new first option, the client will indicate that it's fine with all this, and it will give the proxy an indication for how long this back forwarding of responses should go on. Well, instead, in each response forwarded back to the client by the proxy, there will be information included by the proxy that are essentially the addressing information of the server, so that the client can learn about the servers and distinguish the different responses. And of course, if security has to be ensured, we can have it end-to-end between client and servers using group OSCORE. Next slide, please. So this is the first new option, multicast signaling, intended only for the unicast request sent by the client to the proxy to be forwarded to the group of server. And the value gives a time indication to the proxy. So for how long it should get responses matching with that request to be forwarded back to the client. And taking Christian's suggestion, in this new version, the proxy will remove the option from the request before forwarding it to the servers. Next slide, please. And the second option, response forwarding, this is intended only for the responses forwarded back to the client. The option includes addressing information of the origin server producing the response. And based on the recent review also, now it's the proxy adding the option to the response before forwarding it to the client. Next slide, please. So an overview of the workflow: the client prepares the request. It's intended as unicast to the proxy, but it has a group URI indicating where to forward over multicast the request to. The client prepares the new first option to be included in the request to give the time indication to the proxy. And this time indication takes into account, well, token reuse time local to the client plus processing at the proxy and round-trip times involved on the way. The option is included, the request is sent. Next slide, please. The proxy has to identify the client, presumably through some kind of secure session to verify it's a whitelist client. And the proxy extracts that option, is aware of a time limit and for how long this should go on. It removes the option and it forwards the request to the servers over IP multicast. So as long as the timeout doesn't expire, the proxy is available to accept responses to forward back. And well, observation is an exception here. If an observation is actually ongoing, the matching and forwarding back will go on, of course. Next slide, please. And after the changes in this latest version, the nice thing is that the server doesn't really have to do anything special here, just processes the request and responds to the proxy. And the proxy now produces the new second option, includes it in the response, indicating the URI of the server, essentially. Next slide, please. And finally, the proxy sends back the response to the client, again, subject to that possible local timeout. The client gets the response, finds the option there, and can learn what the origin server is, also to possibly contact it individually later on, directly or through the proxy again. When eventually the timeout client side expires, well, this stops altogether also on the client. Next slide, please. And finally about this, I said already, as we said in group combis, the proxy has to recognize the client as whitelist. So it has to identify it. That has to involve some kind of secure session. And at the beginning, we immediately talk of, well, a detailed ascension client to proxy, which is a pity if you have also group of score involved between client and servers. So a suggestion that came from Joran was that, well, if group of score is used, the proxy can check the counter signature in the request and identify the client correct. That requires, of course, the proxy to have the set of public keys of the clients in the OSCORE group and to keep this set up to date, which would mean some kind of synchronization with the group manager for that OSCORE group. Yet another alternative can be having OSCORE, also for the sake of code reusage, between client and proxy. But then how can things work if we have at the same time group OSCORE between client and servers and OSCORE between client and proxy? And Christian kind of saw this in his review as a possible use case enabling what we are calling now nested OSCORE, now in Appendix A. And in principle, it will work this way. The client, first of all, protects the request to send to the proxy for forwarding with group OSCORE, so using the context shared with the servers. And after that, the resulting protected message would be further protected with the second layer, so with OSCORE, using the context between client and proxy. It's documented in the appendix, but in principle, it's about running OSCORE with the difference that some class U options are processed as class E options. And this includes also the OSCORE option that was the result of the group OSCORE processing. Well, the process is just reversed on the way back when responses come. So we would appreciate feedback, especially on this possible new thing that maybe has even broader applicability. Next slide, please. So yeah, signaling protocol between client and proxy to have proxies working supporting group communication based on the approach of individual responses forwarded back to the client. As next steps, we want to cover the more general case of a chain of proxies, and as Jim suggested in some comments in group combis, actually, we would like to investigate about the definition of HTTP headers as equivalent of the two new COAP options for handling cross proxies involved here. We would much appreciate more comments and reviews. Thank you. That's it for me.
Very good. So What about the group? Has anyone read a version of the draft or is interested in reading a coming version anytime soon? Jim again, and Christian and Carsten. All right. Okay. So for the sake of brevity, actually, we have 10 minutes. So Christian, please go ahead.
Thank you.
I almost forgot that.
Hello again. I'd like to tell you about another time Marco and I had lunch, this time in Montreal. Next slide, please. So thing is, OSCORE by itself is not really nice towards caches because everything is not cacheable. This came up in the context of multicast notifications. This was something that was in the original, back then, OSCORE drafts as OSCORN to some extent. And we now also have a research paper that documents how ICNs can perform a lot better compared to COAP-based networks because they enable caching. Next slide, please. So let's look briefly into why is OSCORE not cacheable. There's two things that make it troublesome. First is that there is a post and a changed code in the requests, at least on the wire, so this makes them uncacheable. And also there is a key ID and a partial IV that's different in any request that also makes a difference in the cache key. And last but not least, an OSCORE context is always only valid for a particular pair of devices, so caching doesn't help a lot in there. Next slide, please. So let's look into what we can do against this. First of all, use group OSCORE, which is kind of the obvious thing to do when there are multiple devices involved in an OSCORE communication. Then we can easily switch to fetch and content for things that are conceptually cacheable. There is, at least the way I read the OSCORE document, nothing in there that forbids that. It just says it's used when it, thank you, that should probably be 204. I happen to mix those things up. Fetch and content codes, they are already in use for observations, so I don't really see any reason why they couldn't be used. And then say we had a way of magically still hitting the cache with a null response, with a new request, but then still the verification would fail because the client would try to unprotect it with its own request in the request key ID rather than whatever populated the cache. Next slide, please. So the thing that we introduce in this document is that there is a consensus request, which is the single request for a particular resource that every client that wants to obtain it has to know. And in that consensus request, the KID and the partial IV are picked, and then everything can be decrypted and verified again. When the origin server produces that consensus request, we call it ticket request. And next slide, please. These ticket requests actually are the precise thing that we have in the multicast notification so far. So how would that work? The client sends a GET protected with its own security context, with its own sequence number, and from the server get back, no, sorry, I won't tell you what I've already told various others, but use this precise request that I protected. This is the consensus request. This is the ticket to the cache. Try again with that. And the client sends that. It hits the proxy. The proxy has already seen the same spiel and has a populated cache and can return a response. Next slide, please. Now that's great for observation, and this is slide, please. Thank you. This is great for observations. This is actually where this is all coming from. This is also great when you have large resource representations, but we try in OSCORE to avoid having those at least at the level of protected messages, because that would mean that the client would have to get the whole thing and then unprotect it rather than getting things in what's called inner blockwise. So the use cases are a bit limited as long as we do it that way. Next slide, please. So there has to be a better way. So let's continue on the track of magically hitting that cache key, because if we can convince the proxy to give us a result, then maybe we don't need that first round trip. And by the way, this is not in the draft yet. This is an addition I came up with in the last few days, so don't expect to find this in the text. But if we could, I think it helps in setting this up. If the client were to include as an unprotected option a hash of that request that it's sending, and the proxy knew that option and knew that on any request it got with that particular option, it could send an old response that contains, in the sense of non-traditional response, a response for option, then this would all work a bit better. Now, of course, the client is leaking towards the proxy, which, mind you, is not part of the OSCORE group, which is why we have this problem in the first place. We don't want to reveal too much to the proxy. It reveals to the proxy that the class of request, but this is what this is all about, because otherwise the proxy couldn't serve a response. So this would also get us a bit further, provided we have a good way of coming up with a deterministic hash that's the same for every request that's ever generated by all those different clients, which is, I think, something that should be easily possible, because we can hash the plain text on the AAD and come up with something. Next slide, please. But maybe we can do better. So if we already have that hash, we could just put that hash in the, not necessarily there, but a client's request partial IV, thus come up with a nonce that is unique over all requests, provided there are no hash collisions, which there are, but nobody can produce them. So that's kind of provided we're using an adequate hash. Put that into the partial IV, and then send that to the proxy. And every client that sends an identical request would come up not only with the identical plain text. Of course, the plain text varies only slightly. Everything fails, but that's OK in this setup. That has this very precise partial IV and key ID, and then send that. And it's not really nonce reused if we do the same encryption and use the same additional authenticated data and plain text. Or is it? And this "or is it" is a very, very important question that I myself can't with certainty answer. So that's where I'm helping to get feedback here. But provided it is, then the proxy sees a deterministic request that could be generated by any client in the group and returns the data, provided the cache is populated. Otherwise, it sends it to the server. The server can verify it and populate the client's cache, the proxy's cache. Slide, please. So there's a few caveats here. The partial IV length is limited to 40-bit. With the birthday paradox, that gives us 2 to the power of 20 requests until we get actual nonce reuse, which is probably not enough. So what I'm introducing there, and I think it also has different applications, is an ID detail, which would be a part of the OSCORE option, so another field in the OSCORE option that behaves pretty much exactly like the ID context, just that on the hierarchy of things, it's kind of below the KID context and below the KID and not above the KID like the KID context. So so that should not be, so this should work here. And the other hard part here is that OSCORE requires requests to be signed. So the 2 ways to go about this is either to create a group member. We already have to create a group member for those deterministic operations that would could be any client. So either we give this group member a private key with which it can sign the requests, and given that by construction this whole thing only works for safe requests anyway, there wouldn't really be a reason for the server to even validate the signature, but formally it needs to be there. Or we'd have to introduce some way of producing group requests that are not signed, and this is something that's not really accounted for in co-op, so that in OSCORE. So this is why the current draft suggests that there is just a group member, that is the consensus client, that can be executed by any participant. So next slide, please. So I'm not sure whether this will stand the test of practicality. I think it will, but the group has much better expertise in these things. I don't know yet whether this is cryptographically valid, and I think there's already comments on the chat on this. And the last thing is whether core is the right place to work on this or to present updates on this. So thanks for your attention, and I'd be happy to. Well, I'll start reading over the chat, but please come to the mic with questions.
So Francesca here. As to the question if core is the right place, in my opinion, yes, absolutely. And I'm willing to read and review this document. I'd like to do it after the next update, since you seem to have an update planned. Thanks.
So just to comment on the topic of the update, some of this is really to kind of make it easier to explain and to lead the way towards the final thing where you only have the consensus request that everyone comes together on. So the update just adds an intermediate step. If you already understand how it's playing together, the update won't help a lot.
I have only one practical question. So you mentioned that in the 503 response, there is what you call a ticket request. And I just wanted to know, where is that? I'm trying to look for it and I cannot find it.
It's on my slide number 8, I think. No, sorry, 6.
Sorry, forward, backward, because I don't have the.
Oh, sorry, backward. 2 more. Yeah, I mean this is not something that I'm actually proposing. So this is about how it works with multicast notifications. But really, observation is the only place where it makes sense that way. So this is more or less copied out of multicast notifications without using the precise terminology.
I guess it uses this as a normative reference. Like you really need to use it, right? It's normative.
So this is kind of the strawman proposal to get from one step to the other and find out where the weak points.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I haven't read it. I'll also put it on my bucket list. It's quite, for the audience, it's quite short at the moment, so should take short time.
I'll try to avoid writing it in a long way.
And we thank you for that. You had really good comments on the chat.
I haven't gotten around to reading them yet, so if someone, if Jim or Carsten wants to say something aloud, that would probably, that might work better before I go through that.
Yeah, so I think solving this problem would be great.
I'll do my best.
And Jim, I think he mentioned something about a class of encryption algorithms for which this wouldn't be doable. Jim, can you elaborate a bit?
There are some encryption algorithms that may have problems with this because you won't be able to. They introduce a little bit of randomness during the encryption process.
Is there a criterion that can be applied to find those, and especially is that a column in the COSI registration?
There aren't any in COSI at the moment.
Okay.
There's, I think there may be 1 or 2 in CFRG, but I'd actually have to go back and reread them rather carefully. to figure out if that's actually true. There's another class of algorithms which we won't be able to use at all because they don't have an IV to any real extent.
Yeah, but then again, you can't really use them with OSCORE anyway, can you?
Yeah, I mean, we can't use them with OSCORE to begin with.
Funny detail here. All those on the last slide, but one. All those consensus requests, all those deterministic requests will actually have the partial IV of 0 because the ID detail goes into the key derivation, which unfortunately needs to be done every time. But that's a trade-off that comes from the choice of nonce length versus input length. So, yeah.
But that's only every time on the request, not the responses.
Yes, that's kind of once per consensus request, which are hopefully few.
Okay. There are other people in the queue, or any more comments? Because we are a bit 5 minutes over time, and I would just like to give room for everybody else to say their words. Okay. Very good. Sorry, Christian, please feel free to wrap up on the.
No, thanks for that feedback. There's a few things that I can work from, and I'll inform you when there's an update. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you very much. And I think that finishes it all. We have had 2 great sessions. Remote participation has worked pretty well. And yeah, I think we are satisfied with the output and the outcome. Thank you for those who stayed even this long, and hope you have a great summer and a great vacation. Oh, the interim? Yeah, so we will have interims coming back in September, I believe, and we are trying to sync between ACE. So there is multiple SDOs and working groups that people
will
are
alternate with we'll alternate with CBOR and avoid the Monday to avoid ACE.
Yes, but we haven't come up. We will send a doodle, but we haven't come up with the right dates because there's also people are attending 1DM, OMA, and a lot of other organizations that, because of the coronavirus, they are having also a lot of virtual meetings. So syncing is a bit harder than it used to. So we are trying to either collocate or have back-to-back meetings. But we will send info on the core mailing list. More questions, please. All right, then Marco, would you like to say anything else just to wrap up and conclude?
Thank you all. Have a good second half of summer.
Yep. So ciao.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.